Why you always want what you don't have. You finally get what you wanted: the job, the relationship, the version of yourself you were chasing, and for a moment it feels like arrival. Then something strange happens. Your attention drifts. What once felt like the missing piece now feels ordinary, and something else immediately takes its place. The brain is built to chase, not to stay satisfied. The human brain is not designed for lasting satisfaction in the way we often assume. Instead, it is fundamentally engineered for pursuit. What feels like wanting something is not just a preference or a thought. It is a neurochemical process shaped over millions of years to keep us moving, searching, and adapting to changing environments. Understanding this helps explain a common modern frustration: why achievements, possessions, and milestones so often feel less fulfilling than expected once they are obtained. At the center of this system is dopamine, a neurotransmitter often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical. In reality, dopamine is more accurately a motivation or anticipation signal. It spikes not when we receive a reward, but when we expect one. The brain releases dopamine most strongly in the moments leading up to reward: the uncertainty, the effort, the possibility of success. Once the reward is achieved, dopamine activity often drops sharply. This creates a built-in imbalance. The chase feels more stimulating than the arrival. From an evolutionary perspective, this design is highly efficient. Early humans who felt intense satisfaction after eating a single meal or finding a safe shelter might have lacked the motivation to continue foraging or improving their situation. Survival required constant movement toward the next resource, not prolonged contentment with the current one. A brain that stays hungry for improvement is a brain that keeps adapting. This mechanism also explains why goals lose emotional intensity after completion. Whether it is a promotion, a relationship milestone, or a material purchase, the anticipation phase contains uncertainty and imagination. We project future happiness onto the object of desire, often inflating its emotional importance. But once reality replaces imagination, the brain recalibrates. The experience becomes part of the baseline, not the peak. This process, known as hedonic adaptation, ensures that emotional highs are temporary, making room for new goals to take their place. Another layer of this system is prediction error: the gap between what we expect and what actually happens. The brain is constantly trying to predict outcomes and adjust behavior accordingly. When something is better than expected, dopamine increases, reinforcing the behavior that led there. When it is as expected, dopamine levels normalize. Over time, as we become accustomed to outcomes, the emotional impact weakens. What once felt extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. Modern life amplifies this ancient circuitry in ways it was never meant to handle. Social media feeds, consumer advertising, and constant visibility into other people's lives continuously reset our expectations. There is always a newer achievement, a better lifestyle, or a more polished version of success to compare against. This keeps the brain in a near constant state of not yet, reinforcing pursuit over satisfaction. Even after achieving meaningful goals, attention quickly shifts outward again, searching for the next gap to close. Importantly, this does not mean satisfaction is impossible. It means satisfaction is not the brain's default resting state. It is something that must be intentionally cultivated rather than passively expected. The brain will always generate new desires because that is how it stays engaged with the world. Without new targets, motivation declines. With too many, contentment becomes harder to sustain. In essence, the brain is a chasing system, not a settling one. It thrives on movement, anticipation, and comparison. Recognizing this does not diminish ambition, it clarifies it. Goals will continue to emerge, but understanding the mechanics behind them allows for a more grounded relationship with desire. Instead of mistaking the chase for a promise of lasting fulfillment, we can see it for what it is: a biological engine designed to keep us moving forward, not to let us stop for too long once we arrive. Scarcity warps perception. Scarcity has a quiet but powerful effect on how we think, feel, and decide. It doesn't just limit what we can access, it actively changes how we perceive value. When something feels rare, distant, or hard to obtain, the mind tends to inflate its importance. what is unavailable starts to feel not only desirable, but essential. This shift in perception is so automatic that we often don't notice it happening, even as it shapes many of our strongest decisions and emotional reactions. At a basic cognitive level, scarcity acts like a spotlight. Human attention is limited, and the brain prioritizes what appears rare or at risk of being lost. This focus is adaptive in survival contexts. For early humans, scarce resources, food, water, shelter, were often the difference between life and death. Paying more attention to scarcity increased survival odds. The problem is that the same mechanism still operates in modern environments where scarcity is often psychological rather than physical. When something becomes scarce, the brain does not evaluate it in isolation. Instead, it compares it to its availability. A common example is how people respond to limited time offers, or only a few left messages. The actual value of the item may not have changed, but its perceived value increases because the opportunity feels temporary. The fear of missing out amplifies desire, sometimes beyond rational proportion. The mind confuses urgency with importance. Scarcity also distorts emotional judgment. When something is hard to obtain, whether it is a relationship, a status symbol, or a career opportunity, it often becomes idealized. The mind fills in the gaps of what is unknown with positive assumptions. In the absence of full information, imagination takes over. This can lead people to believe that obtaining the scarce object will bring disproportionate happiness or fulfillment. Yet once the scarcity is removed and reality sets in, the perception often shifts again, sometimes leading to disappointment or indifference. There is also a social dimension to scarcity. Humans are deeply sensitive to relative position. When we see others possessing what we lack, the sense of scarcity intensifies. This is not just about wanting the object itself, but about what it represents: belonging, success, attractiveness, or security. Social comparison turns scarcity into a moving target. Even when a person acquires something they once lacked, exposure to higher benchmarks can immediately recreate the feeling of absence. Interestingly, scarcity does not only apply to physical objects, it also applies to abstract experiences like time, attention, and opportunity. When people feel they do not have enough time, each hour becomes more precious, but also more stressful. When attention is scarce, distractions become more tempting. The perception of scarcity narrows focus, often improving short-term decision-making, but reducing long-term clarity. It pushes the mind toward immediate gains rather than balanced judgment. Marketing and media environments often take advantage of this psychological tendency. Limited availability, exclusive access, and countdowns are not just informational tools, they are psychological triggers. They activate the brain's sensitivity to scarcity and encourage faster, more emotionally driven decisions. The perception of rarity can transform neutral objects into urgent desires. What might have been ignored in abundance becomes compelling when framed as limited. Yet scarcity is not inherently negative. It can sharpen priorities and encourage action. When resources are limited, people often become more creative, focused, and intentional. The key difference lies in whether scarcity reflects reality or perception. Real scarcity requires adaptation. Perceived scarcity can sometimes be misleading, driven more by comparison than actual need. The challenge, then, is recognizing when scarcity is shaping perception rather than reflecting truth. Many desires are not born from genuine need but from the psychological weight of not having. When this is understood, it becomes easier to separate value from urgency and need from influence. Scarcity will always affect perception. That is part of how the mind is built. But awareness of that influence creates space to respond more clearly, rather than simply react to what feels rare or out of reach. Comparison never stops moving. Comparison is one of the most persistent forces shaping human perception, and it rarely stays still. Even when circumstances improve or goals are achieved, the mind quickly adjusts its reference points and begins measuring against a new standard. This shifting target creates a moving horizon of satisfaction, one that explains why accomplishment so often feels temporary rather than final. At its core, comparison is how the brain evaluates value. We do not experience success or failure in isolation. We experience them relative to something else. A salary feels high or low depending on what others earn. A body feels attractive or inadequate depending on the images we are exposed to. Even happiness is often subconsciously measured against how others appear to be living. This relational structure is deeply embedded in human cognition because it once helped with survival. Understanding one's standing in a group could determine access to resources, safety, and social belonging. The problem is that comparison does not have a natural endpoint. Once a goal is reached, the reference group shifts upward. A promotion becomes normal after exposure to higher positions. A new possession loses its impact once it becomes common in one's environment. What once felt like progress quickly becomes baseline, and attention moves to the next level. The mind is not satisfied with absolute improvement. It recalibrates based on relative position. This constant recalibration is often subtle. For example, a person might work hard to reach a certain income level, imagining it will bring stability and relief. When they reach it, satisfaction may appear briefly, but soon they are exposed to peers earning more, living differently, or achieving additional milestones. Without realizing it, the brain updates what enough looks like. The finish line moves forward, and the sense of arrival fades. Social environments intensify this effect. Humans are highly sensitive to visible indicators of status and success. In earlier times, comparison was limited to a small, immediate group. Today, digital platforms expand that group to include thousands or millions of people. The comparison set is no longer local or realistic, it is global, curated, and often idealized. This expansion creates a continuous sense of upward reference, where there is always someone further ahead in some dimension of life. Another reason comparison keeps moving is that identity itself is fluid. People do not only compare possessions or achievements, they compare versions of themselves. The ideal self evolves over time, influenced by experience, aspiration, and external input. As identity shifts, so does the standard of evaluation. What once felt like success may later feel incomplete, not because it has changed, but because the internal definition of success has expanded. There is also a psychological adaptation effect at work. When people achieve something they once lacked, the emotional intensity of that achievement fades as it becomes familiar. This does not mean the achievement loses objective value, but its emotional weight diminishes. As a result, attention naturally shifts toward new areas where change is still possible. Comparison follows attention, so it moves accordingly. Importantly, comparison is not inherently harmful. It can provide motivation, context, and direction. It helps individuals understand where they stand and what is possible. Without comparison, improvement would be difficult to measure. The challenge arises when comparison becomes the primary lens through which all experience is interpreted. In that state, nothing is ever fully sufficient, because the reference point is always shifting. What makes comparison particularly powerful is that it is self-renewing. Every answer it provides becomes the basis for a new question. Every milestone becomes the starting point for a higher one. It does not resolve itself. It evolves. This is why even sustained progress can feel like chasing rather than arriving. Understanding that comparison never stops. Moving does not require rejecting ambition or disengaging from growth. It simply reveals the structure behind many feelings of dissatisfaction. The mind will always seek reference points, and those reference points will always shift. Recognizing this pattern makes it easier to see achievements more clearly, not as endpoints that should permanently satisfy, but as moments within an ongoing process that the mind will naturally continue to extend. Identity plays a bigger role than reality. Identity often shapes experience more than objective reality does. What something is in measurable terms matters less, in many cases, than what it means about the person experiencing it. The brain does not process life as a neutral set of facts. It organizes events through the lens of who am I, and what does this say about me? This quiet filtering process can dramatically alter how the same situation feels to different people, or even to the same person at different stages of life. At the center of this dynamic is the human need for coherence. People do not just want experiences, they want a consistent story about themselves. Identity provides that story. It acts like a mental framework that assigns meaning to achievements, failures, relationships, and possessions. Without identity, a promotion is just a job change, a relationship is just interaction, and a purchase is just an exchange. With identity, each of these becomes symbolic. They start to represent status, worth, capability, belonging, or transformation. This is why two people can have identical external outcomes, but completely different internal experiences. One person might see a modest success as confirmation that they are on the right path, while another might see the same success as evidence that they are not doing enough. The difference is not the event itself, but the identity lens applied to it. Reality remains constant, but interpretation shifts dramatically depending on self-concept. Identity also shapes desire. People rarely want things in isolation. They want what those things imply about who they are or who they are becoming. A career goal might represent competence and recognition. A fitness goal might represent discipline or attractiveness. A financial goal might represent freedom or security. Once the identity associated with a desire becomes more important than the desire itself, satisfaction becomes more complex. Achieving the goal does not automatically update identity, and without that internal shift, the feeling of completion can remain incomplete. This helps explain why external success does not always lead to internal fulfillment. When reality changes faster than identity, a gap forms. A person may reach a level of achievement that their previous self would have admired, yet still feel unchanged inside. The external validation is present, but the internal narrative has not caught up. In that gap, the mind often generates new goals, not because progress is meaningless, but because identity is still searching for alignment. Identity also filters perception in real time. The same feedback can feel encouraging or discouraging, depending on how it aligns with self-image. Constructive criticism might feel like useful information to someone who sees themselves as capable of growth, but it can feel like rejection to someone whose identity is tied to being already competent. In this way, identity acts as a translator between events and emotional response. Social environments reinforce this effect. People tend to adopt identities based on the groups they belong to, and those identities shape what feels normal or acceptable. Over time, individuals begin to interpret reality in ways that preserve their sense of belonging. This can be helpful, providing structure and confidence, but it can also limit perception by narrowing what feels possible or appropriate. Another important aspect of identity is its resistance to change. While external circumstances can shift quickly, internal self-concept often lags behind. Even after meaningful achievements, people may continue acting as though they are still in an earlier stage of life or capability. This lag creates a mismatch between reality and identity, and that mismatch can influence motivation, confidence, and satisfaction. Ultimately, identity functions as a lens rather than a mirror. It does not simply reflect reality. It organizes and interprets it. Two people can look at the same situation and experience entirely different emotional truths because they are operating under different definitions of self. This does not mean reality is irrelevant, but it does mean that reality alone is rarely what determines how life feels. Understanding the power of identity reveals why change is not just about altering external conditions, but also about updating internal narratives. Until identity shifts, reality will often be interpreted through an outdated framework, and as long as that framework remains in place, even meaningful progress can feel incomplete, not because it lacks value, but because it has not yet been fully integrated into the story of who a person believes they are. Familiarity dulls emotional intensity. Familiarity has a quiet way of reshaping emotional experience. What once felt vivid, exciting, or deeply meaningful gradually becomes ordinary through repetition. This process is so gradual that it often goes unnoticed, yet it plays a central role in why emotional intensity tends to fade over time, even when nothing about the external situation has changed. At the heart of this phenomenon is how the brain prioritizes novelty. New experiences demand attention because they carry uncertainty. The brain is constantly trying to predict outcomes, and when something is unfamiliar, it pays closer attention to build accurate models of what is happening. This heightened attention creates stronger emotional signals. Novelty feels intense not necessarily because it is better, but because it is new and therefore requires more cognitive and emotional resources to process. As exposure increases, the brain becomes more efficient. It no longer needs to devote as much attention to familiar stimuli because it has already learned what to expect. This efficiency is useful for survival. It prevents overload and allows focus to shift toward new information, but it also has an emotional cost. When something becomes predictable, it stops triggering the same level of response. The mind conserves energy by flattening emotional reaction, turning what was once striking into something routine. This process is often referred to as hedonic adaptation, the tendency for emotional reactions to return toward a baseline after positive or negative changes. Whether it is a new job, a relationship, a home, or a personal achievement, the initial emotional spike tends to fade as the experience becomes integrated into everyday life. The change itself remains, but its emotional impact diminishes. One reason this happens is that emotion is closely tied to contrast. Experiences feel strong when they stand out against what came before. A moment of success feels powerful after struggle. Comfort feels meaningful after discomfort. But once a new state becomes the norm, the contrast disappears. Without contrast, emotional intensity weakens. The brain no longer registers the experience as exceptional, it registers it as expected. Familiarity also reduces imagination. When something is new, the mind actively fills in gaps with anticipation and projection. This mental simulation amplifies emotional engagement because the future feels open and uncertain. Once familiarity sets in, imagination is replaced by memory. Instead of imagining possibilities, the brain recalls established patterns. The emotional energy tied to what could be is replaced by the stability of what already is. Social and environmental factors can accelerate this effect. In environments where stimulation is constant and change is frequent, the threshold for novelty rises. What once felt exciting may no longer stand out, because the baseline for stimulation has shifted upward. This can create a cycle where increasingly intense or new experiences are required to produce the same emotional response. However, familiarity is not purely diminishing. It also creates depth, stability, and comfort. While emotional intensity may decrease, emotional meaning can increase in quieter ways. Familiar relationships, for example, may lose the intensity of early excitement but gain trust, understanding, and reliability. The emotional landscape shift rather than simply fading. Intensity gives way to continuity. The challenge lies in how the mind interprets this shift. It is easy to mistake reduced intensity for loss, as if something valuable has disappeared. In reality, the experience has often changed form rather than declined. The brain, however, is sensitive to change and tends to equate diminishing intensity with diminishing value. This interpretation can lead to a constant search for novelty as a way to recover the emotional peaks of earlier experiences. Understanding the role of familiarity helps clarify why emotional life feels cyclical. Intensity rises with newness and settles with repetition, not because meaning disappears, but because the brain adapts. This adaptation is not a flaw. It is a mechanism that allows stability and prevents overload. Without it, every experience would feel equally overwhelming. In the end, familiarity does not erase emotion. It reshapes it. What begins as intensity often evolves into steadiness. The challenge is recognizing that both states are part of the same process, and that emotional depth is not always found in peak moments, but sometimes in the quieter consistency that follows them. The cycle of replacement desire. Desire rarely exists in isolation. It operates more like a sequence than a destination. One want often gives way to another, creating a continuous cycle of replacement rather than a final point of satisfaction. This pattern helps explain why achieving goals so often leads not to lasting contentment, but to the emergence of new goals that feel just as urgent as the ones that came before. At a psychological level, desire is driven by a gap between current reality and imagined possibility. When something is missing, the mind constructs an image of completion. what life will feel like once the gap is closed. This imagined future becomes emotionally charged, often more vivid than present experience. The anticipation creates motivation, focus, and persistence. But once the gap is closed, the mental image dissolves, and the emotional energy attached to it loses its anchor. What replaces it is not satisfaction in a permanent sense, but recalibration. The brain adjusts to the new baseline quickly, treating what was once desired as normal. This is where replacement desire begins. A new gap emerges, sometimes larger, sometimes simply different, and attention shifts toward it. The mind does not remain idle after completion. It immediately begins constructing the next point of tension to resolve. One reason this cycle persists is that desire is tied to identity as much as it is to objects or outcomes. People do not only want things, they want versions of themselves. When one goal is achieved, it often fulfills part of an identity narrative but leaves other parts unresolved. For example, reaching a career milestone might reinforce competence but not security. Or achieving fitness progress might improve confidence but not belonging. As long as identity feels incomplete in any dimension, desire continues to generate new targets. Another driver of replacement desire is adaptation. The emotional system is designed to respond strongly to change rather than permanence. Once a desired outcome becomes stable, its emotional impact diminishes. The brain then seeks new sources of change to reintroduce stimulation. This creates a pattern where satisfaction is temporary, not because outcomes are meaningless, but because emotional systems prioritize movement over stasis. External environments reinforce this cycle as well. Modern life presents a constant stream of new possibilities, comparisons, and benchmarks. Even after achieving a long-sought goal, exposure to alternative paths or higher standards can quickly reintroduce a sense of lack. What once felt complete is now just one step in a much larger landscape. The cycle of desire is continuously refreshed by new information about what is possible or desirable. Importantly, replacement desire is not simply a flaw in thinking, it is part of how motivation is sustained. Without it, people would likely stop pursuing growth once basic needs were met. The ability to generate new desire ensures ongoing development, learning, and adaptation. However, when the cycle operates without awareness, it can create the illusion that fulfillment is always just one step ahead, rather than something that also exists in the present. There is also a subtle emotional shift that occurs between desire and replacement. The intensity of anticipation often feels like clarity, an impression that achieving the next thing will resolve internal tension. When that resolution does not fully arrive, the mind does not question the structure of desire itself. Instead, it updates the target. The focus shifts from what was wanted to what might work better, and the cycle continues. Over time, this creates a pattern where life is experienced as a series of thresholds, rather than a continuous state. Each threshold feels meaningful before it is reached, then quickly becomes part of the background. The mind moves forward not because satisfaction is absent, but because it is transient. Desire is rebuilt again and again, each time attaching itself to a new form. Understanding the cycle of replacement desire does not eliminate wanting, nor does it suggest that goals are meaningless. Instead, it reveals the structure behind motivation. Desire is not a single path toward fulfillment. It is a repeating process of construction, completion, and reformation. Once this is recognized, it becomes easier to see that the next thing is not an exception to the pattern, but the pattern itself continuing in a new form. Across all of these patterns, chasing, scarcity, comparison, identity, familiarity, and replacement desire, a single structure keeps reappearing. The mind is built around movement, not arrival. It generates motivation by creating gaps, amplifies importance through contrast, and then quickly adapts once those gaps are closed. What feels like separate psychological effects are really different expressions of the same underlying system. A brain designed to keep engagement with life active by ensuring that no state of satisfaction remains fixed for too long. This creates a strange tension in human experience. On one hand, these mechanisms are what make progress possible. Without them, there would be little drive to improve, build, connect, or explore. On the other hand, the same mechanisms can make fulfillment feel elusive, because they continuously reshape what enough looks like. Each time a goal is reached or a desire is fulfilled, the reference point shifts, and attention moves forward again. The key insight is not to resist these patterns entirely, but to recognize their rhythm. Wanting will continue to arise. Comparison will continue to update. Familiarity will continue to soften intensity. Identity will continue to reinterpret experience. None of these processes stop, because they are not problems to solve, they are functions of how perception works. What changes with awareness is not the system itself, but the interpretation of it. Instead of mistaking each new desire for a missing piece or each new achievement for a final destination, it becomes possible to see them as part of an ongoing cycle. Life is not organized around permanent satisfaction, but around shifting states of engagement that rise and settle over time. In that sense, understanding these patterns does not end the chase, it changes what the chase means. Rather than a search for something that will finally complete everything, it becomes clearer that the mind is always in motion, always recentering, always generating new directions. And within that motion, there is room to notice that not every gap needs to be filled immediately for life to feel coherent.